Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. Happy Sunday. You might have noticed that Chainsaw Man is more visible than usual. It was not intended, but that gives you the opportunity to look at these two unbelievably sharp rows of teeth. You wouldn't want this guy to bite you, would you? Anyway, so I wanted to respond to a comment that I thought was very apropos and very interesting, which is the question: how do we integrate functions? How do we develop or bring to consciousness a function? Because it's true that for me, maybe for a lot of people, it's not clear. So, for example, if we take an INFJ, we have an NI-FETI-SE function stack. We know that we're NI dominant if we're INFJ, so we don't need to worry too much about the integration of the dominant function. But what happens in the case of the other ones? What is the story here, right? How do we get to bring to integration a function as much as possible? And what are the limits and what are the parameters? So in this context, I want to discuss a comment by Albri Schaffer. Albri, I might have echoed one of his comments before. He's usually a pretty perceptive person, so I encourage you to stick around to hear me discuss his comment and then seek to address his concerns, because these are important. Function integration, how does that happen? Before that, just quickly, I wrote a book on the INFJ personality, the Ecstatic Soul. Sequel's coming out soon, guys, so stay tuned. But until then, that's the number one INFJ book you should get, Deepest Investigation of the Type, and all the links to get the book are below. There's also The Infinite Castle, if you're into magical realism, existentialism, modernism, Kafka, Murakami, Dostoevsky, Camus, existential questions, moral questions. And the rumor has it the main character is an INFJ, so get a copy, supports me. What supports me as well is modest Patreon contribution. The link is below, anywhere from $3 a month. Added up, it really helps me pursue this work on the channel. So thank you so much to my supporters, who of course will be duly thanked in the acknowledgement section of my new book as promised. Now, I suggest that we proceed straight away to Albri's comment. So I'll read it first. It's relatively brief, and I will then try to share some thoughts. Right. So Albri says the following, quote, Ren, I would like to hear your thoughts on what it means to develop a function. That is, we often say things like, quote, until an INTJ develops TE and FI, they can't do X, Y, and Z. End quote. But it also seems impossible for anyone to live their life in any capacity without the ability to make decisions at all, which is in essence what the judgment's functions do. Does this mean maybe that before a function is developed, it still judges, just not well? What are your thoughts? Okay, so excellently phrased question. I think it really gets to the kernel of the issue that we want to discuss and hopefully clarify. I think that if we're not able to clarify the worries and the concerns that are raised here by Albri, in a way we are left with a deficient account of type, right? And we're left with a deficient account of type because, as always, anyone who takes a serious interest in the question of type has to take a serious interest in the question of embodied type. Type are not these floating entities that you can just latch onto and say, I'm this type. They're things that you are, in your life. As I say in the new book, this is a phrase that I like, type blends into life. And in fact, life blends into type as well. So given this, obviously, you live your day-to-day as a person of a certain type, and the type that you are is supposed to help provide an explanation. It provides a vocabulary in which, or whose terms you can rely on, whose terms and expressions you can rely on to explain what you do, how you go about it, your difficulties, your challenges, how you surmount the challenges, how you deal with other people, how you experience this, how you don't experience this the same way another person is experiencing this, so on. So the function stack is part of that vocabulary, it's part of that nomenclature. And if we refer back to the video that I released very recently, which is in fact the video that Als commented on, which is the video on INTJs, I proposed a distinction between and pure NI INTJs, obviously a shortcut, but they look a lot like pure NI INFJs, NIFI INTJs, NIT INTJs. Okay, and I did say that INTJs who have well-developed TE are more likely to somehow, not completely, but somehow fit a little bit of the stereotype, right? And the INTJs who don't, do not. The extreme of the, in literature of the INTJ who doesn't, but who's very developed in FI and very solipsistic in the INTJ way as a result, is Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. Read Crime and Punishment, maybe you've already read it. Raskolnikov, INTJ with NI and FE, highly developed, highly integrated, almost a very little T integrated. Okay, so obviously it's a literary example, it's an inflated example, but it has that virtue of making a case in a very potent fashion. Right? So the question that then arises, as Als correctly sees, is the question. It's in a sense, it's a genealogical question. Right? It's a genealogical question, namely, we're not born at birth. Say if we're an INFJ, okay, we're not born with the four functions equally developed. We know this, first of all, because it's part of our self-understanding that, it's very important in the INFJ self-understanding that INFJs experience difficulties with SE. Right? If you're an INFJ, you probably have that as part of your self-understanding. It's part of what it means to be an INFJ. So part of what it means to be an INFJ is to have issues with SE integration. It can be issues with TI integration, and it could be issues with FE integration. It's true that the dominant function, in a sense, there is a contradiction in the idea that it would not be integrated, because if your dominant function is not integrated, then in a sense it's very hard to know what kind of consciousness you would have, insofar as the consciousness needs to have an anchoring that brings it unity. If it doesn't have unity, if it doesn't have anchoring, then it becomes very difficult to imagine what a human consciousness like this would be like. This is a transcendental argument that actually has analogies and roots in Kant, but I will not go into it. So we leave aside the NI function. For the purposes of this video, I will also leave aside the SE function, at least for the majority of the discussion, because it's accepted that the SE function is very difficult to integrate. Nevertheless, it can be integrated. Now, what you get in the literature a lot of the time, if you read articles or watch videos that discuss this question, one thing that you will notice first is that, surprisingly, those questions about the genealogy of function integration are not the majority of videos. They're a relative minority of videos, which is really, really intriguing, because that topic ought to be absolutely fundamental. We want to know how type blends into life and how life blends into type, because we want to make more sense of our life and live more meaningful, purposeful, and rich life through, among other things, the prism of understanding our life as through the prism of a particular type identification. Life develops. Life is a dynamic organism. So there ought to be a theory of type that accounts for this. So first of all, you notice that there's not a lot there are articles that discuss this, but they're not the majority. So that's one serious problem. One of the reasons why it's not discussed as much as it should be is because, in fact, Jung doesn't discuss it as much as he might have. And I think that insofar as a lot of these articles, a lot of this literature ends up making its way back to Jung, there is this lack of material. and the lack of maybe of innovation in the theoretical purview of new theorists to give that account that is not completely fleshed out in Jung. You can understand it's not completely fleshed out in Jung because Jung was writing 100 years ago. You'd imagine that, you know, there would have been some evolution since then, but there has not been as much as there should have been, in my opinion. Now, when you do have those articles that do discuss the development of functions, so again, focusing mostly on FE and TI in the case of INFJs, FI and TE in the case of ENFPs and ESFPs, TE and you know, T and SE in the case of or pardon me, NI and SE in the case of ENTJs and so on. Now and ENFJs, of course. The usual story, I'm sure you will have come across it. The usual story is that, I think it's psychology junkie, I think. It's either psychology junkie or personality junkie. I always confuse those two websites, the names of those websites. One of them, you know, is pretty decent. You know, it's the one that is run by AC Drenth and his wife and so on. Like, I don't think everything that they discuss and articulate is perfect, but it has some valuable articles that are in depth, and you'll see that there's usually a section on what is the pathway toward developing like secondary and tertiary functions, and even to some degree inferior functions. But usually what you know this is that it's just it's supposed to be a temporal horizon logic. It's like, you know, like when you're 20, your dominant function is the lead function, the others are not so integrated. Then when you reach into your 30s, you know, you begin to see more influence of your auxiliary function. When you reach into your 40s, mid-40s, tertiary function starts to manifest more, and when you approach your 60s, you know, you're supposed to become wiser and have a more integrated SE function in the case of INFJ, so inferior. So this article, or these types of articles, they have the merit of, if you like, inscribing a historical logic to function integration, and that's valid. But the demerit is that they don't actually provide an explanation. They just provide a kind of narrative. And the further demerit is the narrative is not completely, or is far from almost completely inaccurate. It's not completely inaccurate in the sense that, like getting older tends to favor the development of your functions. But it doesn't always happen. And it also happens that you can have well-developed integrated functions earlier in life. Right? You can be 30 and be an INFJ with FE and TI well integrated. You can be 60 and be a pure processing INFJ with only NI integrated. Right? So the explanation remains missing here, you know, and the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that the straight kind of aging story works. It provides a very imperfect account. So in a sense, what we realize is that it's Albry has, consciously or not, and no pun intended, has put us in a pretty difficult situation. We're in a pickle because of Albry. You know, maybe he will gloat about it, be like, I got them, or maybe he will be disappointed. But I think that there's no straight dominant explanation of how we come to integrate functions. There are different attempts to explain it, and one interesting attempt to explain it is the theory of cognitive typology, the ones who use visual cues, body language to assess your type objectively. I recently provided a link to one of the videos on Donald Trump. I don't know if you saw that video. I recommend you have a look at it. I'm not going to go into cognitive types theory of function integration here, but if you guys are interested, I can make a video on what their theory is, because they have great websites, but there's a lot of information. It's not always easy to parse, you know, everything that they're talking about. So there's theories, but they remain theories. You know, they remain views, arguments, that try to base themselves in facts. The reality is, I don't quite know it remains a bit of a mystery to me. What leads someone to integrate a function and for someone else not to integrate a function? It's, one tempting explanation is to say if you're a person of a certain type and you want to develop FE, for instance, put yourself in situations in which the FE function will be manifested inevitably, so social context, for instance, or your function of extroverted judgment. Now, if you do that over time, it's likely that your function will integrate. Same with TI. Put yourself in context where you have to exercise your introverted judgment function. Maybe you read lots of books, try to kind of parse them out, analyze them, do things like that, and it's likely that your JI function will integrate. But that's still not really an explanation. This is just a suggested scenario in which you might get to develop your function. It doesn't really give you exactly the explanatory mechanism of how suddenly the function becomes more integrated. Okay, but that's the best I can do. But there's still another section of Aubrey's comment that I wanted to touch on. Because he says it seems impossible for anyone to live their life in any capacity without the ability to make decisions. Now that's true, okay? Couple things. First of all, it's not clear that decision-making ability is purely to be accounted for in terms of cognitive function stacks. It's possible that, the cognitive function stack of the Jungian cognitive function framework is only one part of the puzzle, and that there's other faculties that are not captured by this model that account for decision-making. So that's the first element. The second element is that, of course, if you're an INTJ, you still use TE even when your T is not highly integrated. Of course, when you're an INFJ, you still use TI even if your TI is not very highly integrated. The idea is that, if you like, the more integrated your function, and again, I want to reiterate that the mechanism by which a function becomes completely conscious or highly conscious is not well understood. There are theories, but there's no dominant accepted paradigm that everyone is subscribing to. Okay, there's just theories. Everyone is on the spectrum from very unconscious to very conscious. If you're an INTJ, the only function really that can be very unconscious is SE. This is not something that I have a theory for, an explanation for, something that I can observe. Same for INFJs. It's equally unlikely for an INFJ that your FE will be completely unconscious. It probably will be, on average, at the threshold of consciousness or slightly above consciousness. But there are INFJs for whom FE is under the threshold of consciousness. Usually how you can tell the difference is that the INFJ with more FE integration has more conscious control over what they can do with their FE function. In other words, an INFJ can actually, if they have the FE integrated, rationalize a course of action in terms of deploying the FE function in order to do that. Right? And they can have confidence that this will be of help. Whereas if it's not well integrated, usually what will happen is that the manifestation of the FE function will be less controlled, less conscious, less controlled. So if it's less conscious, less controlled, if we follow Jung, the inevitable conclusion is that the manifestation will tend to be more naive, more infantile, and more archaic. Right? Same with TI. So it will still be there, you'll still be able to make decisions, all right, and even rationalize decisions to some extent, but you won't be completely in control of what you're doing. You won't be as much distance from the use of that function as you would be able to if you had it integrated. Right? If you have a highly integrated function, in some sense, you're able to collaborate with that function. If you don't have it highly integrated, you're at the mercy of the function. That's how I would distinguish the two. This video has been going on for a long time, so I will stop here. Let me know in the comments what you think, guys, and if you have alternative stories and narratives to tell about function integration. And I will see you on Wednesday. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.